Okay, thank you for coming to this lecture. It is, I think, our privilege to have with us Philip Kitcher, professor of philosophy at Columbia University. We consider him a colleague here since he received an honorary doctorate by our department in 2022, I think. He comes every year and gives us lectures. So tonight he's going to talk to us about a topic that he dealt with in his latest book, What's the Use of Philosophy? I don't know if he will change the title a little, as he told me earlier. Philip Kitcher has started as a philosopher of science. He worked on philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of biology, ethics, philosophy of religion. He expanded the scope of philosophy. He ventured into other fields like literature and philosophy, music and philosophy, and I don't think he ever sacrificed rigor for appeal or popularity, but he always remained a subtle and sensitive philosopher, and we are looking forward to hearing what he has to say today on this important topic for us.
Well, thank you so much, Vaso, and thank you for inviting me. Can everybody hear me all right? Okay, good. So, my title for the book was What's the Use of Philosophy? I was going to change that for this occasion to The What and Why of Philosophy. And that's because I want to talk this evening in a spirit that is much more positive than many people think of when they actually start reading my book, What's the Use of Philosophy? So I want to begin by saying I think that philosophy is an amazingly important discipline. I think it should have a very prominent place in any curriculum, and that its influence should extend into the wider world. Indeed, for a very long swath of the history of philosophy, philosophers were tremendously influential on many, many thinkers, politicians, workers in the sciences, on ordinary people. People clamored to read their works. Isn't quite like that today. So when people pose the question, what's the use of philosophy, they don't usually say it in that sort of gently inquiring spirit. What they say is, what's the use of philosophy? As if it was obvious that philosophy didn't have any use at all. Well, I want to lay that to rest, and at the same time give some sort of rationale for why philosophy has lost its place of such importance in our intellectual and cultural life. So if you look back at the great figures whom we acknowledge as wonderful contributors to the history of philosophy, people like Aristotle and Augustine and Kant and Mill and Marx and Nietzsche, and perhaps I'm being overly fond here, John Dewey, all of these people were acknowledged as immensely influential. I mean, Aristotle and Augustine played a hugely important role in the development of the culture of centuries in the West. Marx's influence on political thought is obvious. In the case of Kant, it's not just that the students lined up to try to get his books, but that, Goethe said of the Critique of Pure Reason that reading it was like walking into a familiar room which was well lit for the first time. And in the case of John Stuart Mill, a British Prime Minister, after Mill's death, referred to him as the soul of reason. This was a man who had had tremendous influence on the political and cultural life of his century in Britain. So, here we are today, and I'll give you a simple sociological fact. there are surely more people writing works under the label or the conception of philosophy today than there ever have been at any time in the historical past. And yet, philosophy's impact on broader culture is almost negligible, it seems. I don't think it's as negligible as it sometimes appears, but it certainly isn't as it was when people were queuing up to read Kant, or when, in the words of Oliver Wendell Holmes, no question in American political and social life had received its final answer until Dewey had spoken on the issue. That's not the way philosophy seems now. I mean, many parents of people who send their children off to university in the Anglophone world are horrified if the child comes home after a year or two and says, I've decided to major in philosophy. It's at that point that you're likely to get the question, well, what's the use of philosophy? Okay. Now, let's start by acknowledging that contemporary philosophers, the ones who write all of those papers and all of those many words that seem to have virtually no impact, still do some extraordinarily important work. And they do it in their role as teachers. Philosophy is a very, very important part of the curriculum because we have learned how to teach people to think better and more clearly and more rigorously than they do. That's a really good thing. And many students who don't major in philosophy, don't go on to major in philosophy, benefit from that. They learn how to think more clearly about all sorts of issues, and that helps them in their lives as they go forward in their lives, as they deal with political and social and personal problems. They at least have the tools, or better tools than they once had, for thinking those things through. But it comes with a but. This improved teaching is achieved not simply by teaching students formal logic. Formal logic is helpful to many of them. But what really helps is doing something with them on what we might think of as traditional philosophical problems. We take students through a traditional problem, the problem of freedom and determinism, say, or the problem of the existence of evil, and so on and so forth. We take them through those problems, we show them how to lay out the argument, we show them how to make creative responses to that argument, and they gradually learn what sophisticated reasoning about an issue can be like. And it's fine if they then go on quite innocently into the world and become lawyers or musicians or business people or bus conductors or gardeners or whatever, armed with these tools for better thinking. That's great. But we also, of course, train people who go on to become professional philosophers. And we do that really, really well. I have a conjecture to make, and it's possibly refutable, but it seems to me that almost all second-year graduate students could run rings round any of the great figures whose works we read from the history of philosophy. Those guys just weren't as sharp at the technique of reasoning as our typical graduate students are. We know how to do that. And so these reasoning skills, they become so refined, so well honed, and the temptation then comes to use them and use them and use them and use them. And so what do? Well, you're a philosopher, you want to become an academic philosopher, and you decide that you can use your very, very wonderfully refined techniques of reasoning on the traditional problems of the past. So you go to these traditional problems and you are able to spot some creative ways of reshaping them, and so you generate something. But there are lots more of you doing it too, and those people can see how to do the same sort of thing with respect to your proposals. And so the questions go deeper and deeper and smaller, and the perhaps the large traditional question is lost, and journals proliferate filled with articles that very few people read that are concerned with really minute issues worked out in enormous detail. The technique easily becomes the focus, and that's sad. Philosophy then starts to lose contact with other fields, let alone with the broader public. Philosophers start to get isolated from other disciplines in the humanities. Historians, people in literature, people who do art history say, I find most of the things that my philosophical colleagues are doing utterly unreadable. I just don't get the point of it. We become isolated, cut off. So some years ago, I made up a little parable about this. I imagined a musical community. Now, musicians need to learn technique. So you can imagine a whole bunch of people learning to play the piano, and their technique over time gets better and better and better, and they play these exercises with ever more dexterity and skill and speed. And now imagine that the musical community becomes so interested in this technical prowess that it starts to hold competitions to see who can play these etudes that are written, say, for the piano, with the most sort of bells and whistles on them at the fastest speed, etc., etc., etc. And the competitions take over, and the great pieces of the past become secondary, something for second-raters who go out and slum it. And that's sad. We lose the music, but the technique keeps getting better and better and better. And that's a way of putting my worry about some of today's professionalized philosophy. Now, you might say that's really quite unfair, because this goes on all over the place. It's not just something that happens to philosophy. We live in a professionalized intellectual and cultural world. And so things get more and more technical, and the issues get smaller and smaller. But that's really all right. It's a good form of the division of labor. I mean, think about the natural sciences. In the natural sciences, all sorts of technical work gets done. You know, some molecular biologist is very interested in the particular way that a particular molecule in a particular model organism functions. I mean, you know, the treatment of this is very, very difficult for lay people to understand. Isn't that roughly the same kind of thing? And I want to say, no, there's a difference. The difference is that if you go to that molecular biologist and say, why are you doing this? Why is it so important? The molecular biologist will tell you a story that goes something like this. Well, if I can figure out the function of this molecule in this organism, I have a colleague over here who's working on another molecule that interacts in the cell at a relatively early stage of development. And I think that with his research and with my research, then we can start to make we can start to answer a more interesting question about the way in which, at a very early stage of development, things go. And then there are other colleagues who are working on other molecules and on other cells, and if they can have breakthroughs and find the answers to the questions that they are investigating, then we can put their work together with this more interesting work that our group over here has done. And then we can eventually, out of doing this, cumulatively build up a picture of development, just in this organism to begin with. But then, once we've done that, we'll be able to extend to other organisms, and maybe, at the end of the day, we'll not only be able to understand how fruit flies develop, but we'll be able to understand how plants develop, we'll be able to understand how mice develop, maybe we'll even start to understand the molecular biology of development in our own species. And that will not only be a great project for the simple understanding of life and how it develops, It will also probably have practical significance too, because it may give us some new tools for fighting various diseases. That's the sort of story that scientists can, I think, regularly tell in the flourishing sciences. So the technique and the technicality serve a purpose. They are part of a much bigger set of projects that build together towards something. Philosophy, as it's practiced in the Anglophone world today, with the minutiae of the problems studied and the lack of agreement, instead of getting sort of consensus on sort of particular findings, it's as though at every level you get a new kind of criticism, and another series of questions develop that are even smaller. So you don't get this kind of cumulative development. And I don't think that philosophers could tell a story of the same kind as the one that the sciences could. But there are other disciplines that don't work like that. Look at mathematics, for example. I mean, mathematics is far more technical than philosophy. I mean, I have served in my time on various academic committees to review people in various disciplines, and mathematicians are dead easy to evaluate because they all agree on who knows what and what's most important, but they're impossible to evaluate by outsiders. I was an undergraduate mathematician. I can get about halfway down the first page. If you've got a good mathematical physicist on your committee, that mathematical physicist can probably get onto the second page, but after that it's all darkness. So mathematics, is just completely different. It's sealed off completely. So mathematicians are held in high regard, even though their work seems to have no immediate impact on other disciplines. I'm talking about pure mathematics now, obviously. Okay, well, this is an interesting case, and it's interesting to think about the history of mathematics. So if we go back to the Renaissance, in the Renaissance, of course, they didn't have television. So in the evening, what did you do? Well, you might go down to the Pitti Palace and watch Tartaglia and Cardano perform together. These guys are not conjurers, although they have the same sort of status. They're actually mathematicians, and they're given problems, and they solve them in public. It's entertainment. Okay, well, perhaps not as entertaining as watching TV, but okay, so it's no surprise that in the early 17th century, when Galileo is going to be hired in Tuscany, he pleads with the court in Tuscany to appoint him as a philosopher and not as a mathematician. Mathematicians are low-budget kinds of guys. I mean, most of them do surveying and accounting and engineering. Some of them, the pure ones, are basically court entertainers. Well, they have a second job. They do something different. Fast forward a century or so, and mathematicians have the status they have today. Why is that? Because of the tremendous success of late 16th and early 17th century mathematics, culminating in the invention or discovery, as you like it, of the calculus by Newton and Leibniz, and after that, the use of the calculus, and especially of differential equations, in the burgeoning mathematical physics of the 18th century. So by the time you get to sort of 1750, mathematics is high stuff, and philosophy is still high stuff because philosophy is a general term that covers people doing what we would call science. Scientists and natural philosophers. Okay, so what has happened in this process is that a license has been given to the community of mathematicians. Mathematicians, go play your games. They look as though you are just playing games. You're trying to solve these problems that spin off of the mathematical languages you've been using up till now. Yeah, keep doing that, and every so often you'll deliver us something that's really useful for our work in understanding the physical and the social worlds. Think about game theory, for example. Okay. Now, if philosophy had a track record of constantly yielding results or ideas or frameworks that could be used again and again and again in a productive way in other disciplines, then it might be legitimate to say the same to philosophers. But the general view is that philosophy never gets anywhere. It never arrives at any definite conclusions. I think that misses the point, and we'll come to that in a bit. So I'm going to come back to this argument about a license to philosophers to go and play at the very end of my remarks today. Okay. So let's ask what philosophy could contribute to the world in which we live. Well, I started by talking about these skills of reasoning through issues. And one thing you might say is that these skills can be used on the difficult political and social problems of the day. And I have been delighted over the last decade and a half to see among philosophers a trend to what is now called public philosophy. That is, philosophers are getting involved in contemporary social, political, and cultural issues and bringing considerable clarity to them. So that's one really useful thing to do. But then there are a whole host of traditional ventures in philosophy that I think are incredibly worthwhile, although they are not always given the credit that they are due. There are all of those philosophy of disciplines. You know, many people who think of themselves as pure philosophers tend to say, yes, it's very worthy work to do philosophy of science or philosophy of art or political philosophy, but these really aren't the core of the subject. These aren't the places where the action is. I think that's dismissive and unfair. I think that these subjects are immensely important, and that philosophers over the last century have played a very important role in understanding art and science and normative ethical issues and political issues. I think, for example, of the work of John Rawls. I mean, surely one of the works that is likely to live from the last century or so is Rawls's book, A Theory of Justice. And philosophy has contributed to new disciplines. It's been an important part of cognitive science. So there are lots of ways in which philosophy, working in alliance with other fields of inquiry, has contributed a very great deal, and that shouldn't be forgotten. Okay, so two ways in which philosophy can make a contribution, and perhaps makes more contribution than is acknowledged by those who say, what's the use of philosophy? But I don't think what I've said so far is anywhere near enough. There is something missing. We shouldn't think of philosophers as all-purpose handymen. People who go to a particular area of science and illuminate some particular dispute within that area, as many philosophers have done, or a philosopher like Alexander Nehamas here, who goes to the field of art and writes in a beautiful and illuminating way about artworks that increase our understanding of those works of art. But still, beyond what I've said so far, there is more. There is a conception that William James makes explicit in his lectures on pragmatism, where he says very boldly, the whole function of philosophy is this: to derive from a universal formula for the world the consequences for human life and human action. I'm paraphrasing, but the whole function of philosophy is this, I think, are James's words. Okay. Now, James said it actually more simply and more clearly in a much earlier thing that he wrote, before he was officially a philosopher at all. He asked himself the question, why do we philosophize? And his answer was, well, what we're trying to do is to make sense again, I'm going to loosely paraphrase what James said, that chaotic view of the world which each of us carries around with us under his hat. Okay, the idea that we all have these rather confused views about how the world as a whole works. And philosophy's task is to bring more systematic organization to that. That's of a piece, I think, with a very famous definition of what philosophy is offered by Wilfrid Sellars, who says it's the study of how things in the widest sense of the word hang together in the widest sense of the word. I think all of these sort of formulations, rough and as they are nonetheless on track with something. And that something goes back actually to the origins of philosophy in the Western tradition, to Athens, in fact, and to all of those people who started schools for the privileged young men, just the cream of the cream, I think, to show them and to teach them and to develop them so that they would understand how to live. That's Socrates' great question, really, how to live. It's two questions. It's a question about how each of us sort of finds our own life and fashions our own life. It's also a question about how we should live together. And so I think those two things are together. They're not explicitly distinguished in the early phases of Greek philosophy. Okay. This, too, it seems to me, is a very, very important idea. What lies at the heart of James's vision is that each of us has some sort of vague understanding of how the world is as a whole and of our own place in it. And what we need to do is be led to make wise choices about how we ourselves will steer our way through it. We need to figure out how we are going to live. I think John Stuart Mill, whom James officially acknowledges as the precursor to the pragmatism he wants to espouse, I think John Stuart Mill has that idea. Mill looks at human life and he sees that it's mainly constrained and confined. And he declares very boldly and on liberty that the only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, so long as we do not thereby interfere with the like projects of others. That is, approximately a sentence from On Liberty. I don't have it in front of me. So this is Mill's privileged freedom. And I think Mill is full of regret that so many people in his time and so many people throughout history have not had that freedom or have only had it to a very limited degree. And so the great task he sees for humanity is that of enlarging that freedom for everybody and giving each individual the tools of making good use of that freedom, the tools to understand enough about himself or herself and about the world in which he or she lives, so as to make wise choices about what to pursue, what's worth pursuing, and how to pursue it. Okay, so philosophy in this sort of guise is reasonably seen as a theory about education. It's about what really matters in preparing people for life and guiding them through it, assuming that that guiding will be done by themselves. Dewey's idea of philosophy as the general theory of education doesn't seem so silly if you see it in those terms, nor does Emerson's strange claim in The American Scholar: the main enterprise of the world for splendor, for extent, is the upbuilding of a man. For Emerson, what's really important, he should have said human being, of course, but he didn't. Well, for Emerson, what's truly important is people's learning how to grow and develop and become themselves. So all of these ideas have something of the same flavor to them. And philosophers sometimes do that. They do return to Socrates' question. Again, Alexander has done this in some of his own writing. This is the heart of philosophy, I think. And it relies on an ability to do something which is largely marginalized in most of our professional philosophical education. Because this is not really about analyzing, although analyzing must come into it. Analysis is important. It's also about synthesis. It's about finding a way to fit things together. Think of the two, perhaps the two greatest of all of the philosophers in the history of Western philosophy, Aristotle and Kant. What is it that they give us? They give us a system, a huge systematic picture, not really of the whole, because even then there was too much to the whole for any single individual to do it, but they give us a very big picture of what the world is like and what humans' place in it might be. Okay, we live in a much more specialized world, so we can't hope, I think, to do a synthesis as grand and as ambitious as that. But there are possibilities of more limited syntheses, of fitting together, trying to understand how, for example, economics relates to public policy and how both relate to our educational system, of how religion of various kinds fits within a society where there are plural views. All of these things are views about questions about how we bring together ideas, arrangements from different domains of life and try to understand them in relation to one another and thus to try to improve them. So I think we can do synthetic work either as individuals or perhaps as teams of individuals with different understandings and different perspectives on things. And the privilege of being a philosopher, as a senior philosopher once told me some years ago, is you're allowed to read anything. And that seems to me right. I mean, what philosophizing is, for many of the great philosophers who have preceded us, is ranging over a large number of areas of life and over a large number of disciplines and trying to make sense of the whole. And in contemporary philosophical education, professional philosophical education, we have privileged analysis at the cost of synthesis. So, I mean, Kant famously taught all sorts of things. Anthropology, bits of cosmology, right? Adam Smith also ranged from jurisprudence to implicit, early economics, to moral philosophy, to astronomy. I mean, these people were widely read across vast numbers of disciplines. The same is true of Rousseau, the same is true of Schopenhauer. Great philosophy seems to have emerged from the minds of people who didn't think that their task as a philosopher was to sit down on a particular journal with a particular journal and all its last issues and read those papers again and again and again obsessively so that you could write something that was even more meticulous and rigorous and detailed about the very small question that was being discussed. Okay, so there's a danger too that comes with synthesis, and that is that synthesis will take over at the cost of analysis. That's not what my proposal here is. These analytic skills are really worth having, but they should be married to and perhaps subservient to a search for a synthetic vision. So that's my proposal for what's missing. So I give you three things. I give you, first of all, public philosophy as it's currently starting to be practiced, which I think can do a considerable amount of good. the traditional work of doing philosophy in conjunction with some other area of human life or some other form of inquiry, and the traditional philosophical search for an answer to the question how to live, conducted through an attempt to try to make the world fit together. I mean, there are all these people, these great experts, who are going around giving us more and more detailed knowledge about all sorts of phenomena. The role of the philosopher is to work among them, to find a way of fitting all of the things that they tell us together into some coherent whole, and of evaluating it. Okay, now this, you will notice, allows me to say something about a criticism that's often made of philosophy. You know, philosophers, they just sit in their armchairs, you know, spin up ideas out of their heads. No, they don't do that. Philosophers who work on public philosophy go out and learn a lot about a particular issue and try to analyze it. Philosophers who work on art or on science learn a lot about the art and about the science, and then they try to make philosophical sense of some difficult things that have arisen within it. And philosophers who are engaged in this kind of synthetic activity try to understand a number of different domains of human life or of human inquiry and find ways of making them work harmoniously together. So, what's the legacy of philosophy? I mean, philosophers don't agree on very much. You know, we're notoriously critical and inclined to make disputes whenever anybody says anything. So what actually do we give the world? Well, if you think about it, we give the world quite a lot. Ways of thinking about things. Let me just give you a couple of examples. So after Plato wrote the Euthyphro, it was no longer possible, I think, to be completely confident in the idea that ethical truths flow from the commands of a deity. That insight was deepened later by Kant, who said, look, in order to be able to recognize Jesus as the Holy One, I've got to have an independent way of assessing what Jesus says and does. I've got to have an independent assessment of the good. So that's one kind of thing that philosophy has given us. And there's another. I'm going to take a little bit more time with this one. So after Hobbes, we have the concept of the state of nature, and we have, in political philosophy, the idea of a different kind of state that comes into that rather nasty state. It's nasty, the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. How does Hobbes get to that? Well, Hobbes has read a lot. He's read mathematics, he's read sort of the early natural philosophy, the natural science of the period, and he starts off by thinking about what a human being is. And his views about human beings and their behavior are very much shaped by his views about how things work, which is basically matter in motion bumping into other bits of matter in motion. And out of that, he develops a picture of a sort of very crude picture of human psychology, into which he builds various emotions and tries to characterize those, and that leads him to the idea of people as being naturally quarrelsome and naturally out for their own interests, and then he plonks this individual whom he's constructed into a political state, and he calls it the state of nature, the war of all against all. It's a brilliant and powerful conception, and it remains with us as a way of thinking about certain kinds of issues about politics. It's not that we accept the theory of Leviathan. It's not that we accept the propositions of that book, but we've been given a new perspective on important phenomena. Okay. All right, so I've given you an account of what philosophy is and why it's important. At least I hope I have. But it doesn't satisfy all my critics. So I'm going to turn to something that was said to me, actually written about this, by a person whom I think is a good and sympathetic critic, Professor Bill Lycan, who teaches at the University of Connecticut. He said, look, there's something missing in your account, and what's missing in your account is this, that there are certain questions that are fundamental questions, and there are certain people, and he said this, he wrote this rather, there's a tinge of regret about it. There are certain people who are driven to pursue these questions. They can't not do them. They've got to attack the fundamental questions. You're not appreciating this aspect of philosophy. And I actually think that this is an interesting criticism, but I think it's in the end wrong. I would like to ask him, what is it that makes a question fundamental? We have a use for that phrase, fundamental question. It's used all the time. There are certain kinds of questions that are fundamental in physics. There are certain kinds of questions that are fundamental in biology. There are certain kinds of questions that are fundamental in economics, etc., etc., etc. What makes a question fundamental? And the obvious answer to that is a question is fundamental if you need to answer it to get on with lots of other questions that matter to you. So, there's a test for a fundamental question. Is this a question that we need to answer in order to answer other questions that matter? And my criticism of what I think of as professional analytic philosophy in the Anglophone world today is really, I would really like to put it differently. I would really like to put it as a question. So if you think that you're doing something that is intellectually very important, reflect and try to explain why the question with which you're dealing is a fundamental one. Try to show me what it is that makes that question necessary to answer before we can answer other things that matter to us. I think that's the sort of question that a philosopher should pose to himself or to herself. I think we should worry about whether what we're doing is mere play or whether it's something that actually does have a bearing ultimately on other things. As Hobbes showed that certain kinds of questions that he was dealing with at the very beginning of Leviathan did have a bearing on other things. I think that we return in the present age so often to the great philosophers of the past, and history of philosophy today is really flourishing. And I think it's flourishing because one of the things that people can do is that they can try to take one of the great synthetic visions of the past and see how to work it out more thoroughly, or to work it out in light of things that have since been learned. I think the history of ancient philosophy, the history of certain areas of modern philosophy, I think particularly of Kant studies, is thriving today. And it's thriving, I think, in part because there's this sort of yearning for the synthetic vision. And so if you can't construct one, at least try to reconstruct one that was given in the past. Okay. I'll end with a different thought, and this also comes from another critic, another sympathetic critic, a good friend of mine, Chris Peacock. So Chris is very impressed by the fact that from time to time, certain kinds of things done in philosophy are then taken up and used by some new discipline. So there are certain kinds of formal systems that have in fact been developed by logicians and then have been taken up and used in completely unexpected ways. Chris thinks that he himself, in his work on concepts and sense and reference, has assembled materials that give us a better understanding of music. I don't think he's quite right about that. I think he did get to his views, his insightful views about music, out of the very sort of technical philosophy of language, philosophy of mind material that he's developed, but I don't think it was necessary, and in fact I think it gets in the way of his insights. But what the form of this argument is very simple. Give philosophers a license to do their thing. Just let them play freely, and they will deliver things that are needed and are useful. Well, I think that's a perfectly good argument. I call it the argument from serendipity. And it really turns on how frequently we do it. If we do it often enough, then I think we would be as justified as the mathematical community to receive a license to go and do our completely pure and technical thing. But I don't think we do that. I think logicians do it more often than other people from other areas of philosophy, and in a sense they already have a license because they're part of mathematics departments. But it's a funny thing. The license given to mathematics is actually not in any way complete. Nobody wants to get rid of applied mathematics. Nobody wants there to be more pure mathematicians than there are applied mathematicians. And indeed, as my friends tell me, jobs for pure mathematicians are starting to dry up. Well, mathematics had a really good run from, about 1687 on. But in recent years, it's become more and more detached, and that has led the mathematical community to place more emphasis on applied mathematics. So I'll leave you with a version of my musical analogy. Okay, it's as if the argument from serendipity says to us something like this. Keep doing that technique. Keep doing that technique. It will yield lots of new compositions in time. I don't think that's particularly likely in the case of music, and I don't think it's particularly likely in the case of philosophy. And in a world where there is so much muddled thinking and so much turbulence and such a lack of ideals by which to steer, I think we can do much better. So I would like the philosophical community to ask itself that question. What are we doing, and why are we doing it? Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Philip. Now we open the floor to questions. Yes?
Thank you so much for being here and being so inspiring. I would like to know your opinion.
Could you speak up a little bit? Yeah.
I would like to know your opinion about something. What, in your opinion, philosophy needs to change, or in the way that it works till now, so that it would make it more favorable to more people?
I think that if philosophers started doing if the profession as a whole was seeing as doing the kinds of things that I've listed, the three kinds that I've suggested, then I think the image of philosophy would change. It may be that it's already changing for the better. I mean, I think the fact that philosophers have spoken out so much more on public issues recently has changed people's perceptions of philosophy for the better. But I also think that we need to change philosophical education. I think we do have to. This may be a matter of using the history of philosophy in a different way, of calling attention to the ways in which philosophers in the past made their principal contributions, and in particular philosophers who have given us visions of new ways to think about things, because many philosophers have given us that. I mean, there are so many, I think, enduring concepts and enduring perspectives that come out of the history of philosophy. I think understanding the genesis of those and how those are rooted in a philosophical system would actually be quite good for getting people into what I think of as the synthetic mode. I don't think we should stop emphasizing analysis, but I think we should be very clear that analysis is not something to be pursued for its own sake. So those are very sort of quick and straightforward answers to your question.
Thank you so much. Chris.
Yes, that was a wonderful talk. Thanks a lot. So I would like to ask, what should be the role of wisdom in contemporary philosophy?
Well, I guess it seems to me that that to become wise is really to answer Socrates' question, and I think it's implicitly there in my suggestion that, you know, the root of what I think of as synthetic philosophy is what Socrates is asking for. I think he wants us to understand and through understanding how things fit together and our own place in it, to be able to make wise choices for ourselves. So, you know, the clear-eyed vision of how things fit is something of a precursor to, you know, the good life, and the good life embodies wisdom in that way. I think Mill had the same idea. I mean, when he later in his writings, he doesn't just leave us with that claim about, you know, the only freedom worthy of the name is to choose your own good and pursue it in your own way. He actually says things like, well, we need choices such as a well-developed individual would have. And by well-developed, he doesn't just mean cognitively well-developed. He means emotionally well-developed, socially, in relation to others, well-developed. So I think in Mill you have the same yearning for the revival of wisdom as you know, what is needed to be the Socratic good liver.
Okay, thank you for the talk. Yes, I have two comments that are not related to each other. So the first comment is that you presented a picture of philosophers, and particularly young philosophers, your students, as people who have become extremely good at reasoning. They have high logical skills, but deal with specialist questions that attract the interest of very few people. Now, as you know, there are many places in the world where young philosophers are not trained in such a way as to become highly skilled at reasoning, but they may have cultivated other abilities, say a particular sensitivity to understanding texts written at different times.
Yep.
Of course, that doesn't ensure that their work will be relevant to the broader public, or that it will attract the interest of many people, because one may be an excellent scholar of 14th century philosophy, but deal with specialist questions that interest very few people. Still, it's something different, so I wanted to say that as a comment on the picture of young philosophers that you presented.
What's the comment?
Okay,
Two comments.
Now,
For the time being.
I haven't said the second comment.
Okay, let me address that one, and then you can give your second one. You're completely right. I'm talking really about the Anglophone world. Britain and the United States, Canada, Australia, but it has offshoots all over the place. It has offshoots in lots of places in continental Europe as well. I mean, it's usually not as extreme in the sort of the places that it goes to outside the English-speaking world, but it's nonetheless there. So, I mean, there are European countries. I mean, Finland is an obvious example where you have a very strong tradition of what I think of as high analytic philosophy. But it's interesting that you pointed to the detailed study of particular texts from the past. I mean, that's the history of philosophy, and very often, and it can be done either with respect to a single figure, and it can be done as in a comparative way. It seems to me that whether it's done on a single figure or in a comparative way, it is a first step towards something. And the first step towards something is the reconstruction of a vision of the world and the human place in it. And if the scholar just leaves it with, the elucidation of what was said, it may fail in a potential broader function, namely to introduce ideas from that thinker that are still relevant to human life today into the lives of other people. So I'm not happy with when scholarship, even on an individual, just stops there. I'm much happier when it is then used and developed to illuminate some feature of the contemporary condition or some contemporary problem. I think we return to the history of the great figures in the history of philosophy because they're still relevant as philosophers. And leaving them as sort of, great canonical texts who are now completely understood and that's the end of it, seems to me to shortchange them.
Okay, so the other comment is to do with what you said about fundamental questions.
Yes.
But it's not exactly that. So I think that sometimes people do work in, say, logic or metaphysics, which deals with specialist questions, but is related to issues that have to do with the more general question of what are the abstract features of reality, or what are, if there are any, the basic aspects of common sense that are incorrect. Let me give you an example. A philosopher logician may do a lot of formal work on, say, the law of excluded middle.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if the law of excluded middle and other similar logical principles are in fact abstract metaphysical principles intended to capture the general traits of reality, then that kind of research, although it may be formal and initially seem irrelevant, gets some significance because it touches on the question, what are the most general features of reality?
Mm-hmm.
Now, and so it touches on a question that is about reality, but it is more abstract than what physics can normally tackle. Of course, a philosopher may deal with such questions in conjunction with physics. So that will be philosophical work displaying one of the kinds of usefulness that you presented. But one may do that without any connection with physics, say dealing with paradoxes or something like that, but still have some significance because of the general issue they touch.
I think you're saying something, you're giving something with one hand and taking it back with the other. There's this idea that just knowing that something is a general feature of reality is important for us, whether or not it then affects any of the ways in which we go on to work out the details of reality.
Yes.
I think, it might be a nice thing for people to know, but why is it so significant? I mean, what is it that makes it significant? I mean, there's a lingering thought here, which I think is a kind of hyped up end of Nicomachean ethics, Aristotelianism, that the highest good is somehow to know the purest kind of truth, and I'm very suspicious of that. We live in a complicated and turbulent world where lots of things are wrong and there are lots of problems to solve. And it seems to me that the search for a truth which might be lovely to contemplate, but has no impact whatsoever on anything, any other area of inquiry. I mean, why? I mean, where does the significance come from?
We philosophers have a desire for knowledge. And
Yeah, but we don't have much of it, do we, as philosophers?
as Aristotle, for example, says at the beginning of physics. And
I thought he thought that was not true just of philosophers, but of everybody.
yeah, it's
Okay,
true.
let's move on because there are some, yes.
Thank you. Here. Thanks for the talk. I have a question, it's, I guess, more practical about the jobs. What is a philosophy job? Because I think mainly it's an academic job, right? And I was wondering whether philosophy should expand what counts as a philosophy job, or like philosophers, right, for that. And especially for education, since you mentioned education. And I was wondering whether it would be a pursuit, that would be worthy to actually try and implement in schools philosophy courses, and not just in universities.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people are driven into academia because they don't find any other way to exercise their philosophical abilities. I mean, of course, there is like this thing that you can become a great lawyer if you're a good philosopher, okay? But some people don't want to be lawyers, so what are you going to do about it? And it seems, as you point out, that with the sociological fact, that a lot of people are in doing philosophy in academic setting, and maybe they shouldn't be doing that. Maybe they should be doing something else in, say, being teachers in schools. And instead of doing that, they are pressured into being academics, or at least trying to be academics, because there is no other option. And maybe we could solve this if we,
So throughout the history of Western philosophy, the vast majority of philosophers didn't teach in universities. I mean, think of all the people, right? I mean, who weren't academics. You know, you can. You certainly before the university came into existence as a sort of an institution, they weren't university professors. But you know, Spinoza wasn't, Descartes wasn't, Leibniz wasn't, Locke wasn't, Hume wasn't, Mill wasn't. I mean, you've got so many great philosophers who, you know, who didn't do it as teachers, university teachers. Okay, but I'm completely in agreement with you, and I will say something that that supports what you've said. There's very good evidence from some graduate programs in the United States which have sent philosophers out to philosophy graduate students out to teach in schools that where students have a lot of trouble. So, for example, quite near Columbia University, there are some schools where there are a lot of struggling students. So philosophy graduate students went out, they persuaded the school to have a philosophy club. There was a philosophy club. The students who came to the philosophy club were taught about some philosophical problems in roughly the way that they would be taught if they went to university, possibly more slowly and with a little bit more simplification. And those students benefited enormously. Philosophy in the schools is a very, very, very good idea, and it would be great if we actually had philosophers going and helping teach students how to think better. So it's a terrific idea. But there are also cases of people hiring philosophers as consultants in various kinds of businesses. I mean, there is, in some circles, there's a growing interest. You know, there are all these smart people out there, and they really know how to think things through. And we could make better use of them than having them write these incomprehensible articles. So let's hire one or two. And so there may be other job possibilities. I think it doesn't have to be restricted. I mean, you know, you could maybe we should have people writing sort of civil service, serving as civil servants. After all, Mill was wrote memos about how to run India. He was a member worked for the East India Company. So yeah, there are a number of other possibilities, but the educational function in the schools is a great idea, a proven great idea actually, or I should say a confirmed great idea.
Okay. Yes, please. And then question from us. Yes.
Yeah, my question is related to a previous comment. So, you qualified it also throughout the talk, but also in response to the question that you're only talking about the Anglo-Saxon style of philosophy, analytic philosophy. And in the question, the alternative that came up was history of philosophy.
Yep.
But I was wondering, I mean, often when we're talking about the divide in philosophy, we're talking about the continental versus analytic. And some of the standard criticisms that proponents of this style of doing philosophy formulate against Anglo-Saxon analytic style philosophy is precisely that it's hyperfixated and it's very specialized problems that they lose sight of big picture questions. And continental philosophy seems to be something different than history philosophy. History philosophy is still kind of fixated in getting the details right and things like that, whereas you could think that continental philosophy draws on the history of philosophy but still pursues these big picture questions. So one could be tempted to think that we needn't try to look any further. There's already a very well-established different way of doing philosophy, and this is what we do in order to say philosophy. I don't like this conclusion, and so I want to resist it, but I was wondering whether you could make any, and I don't think that this is a conclusion you would draw, but I was wondering whether you want to make any specific comments on contemporary philosophy in its continental.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not sure there is any such thing as continental philosophy. I don't believe that the English Channel marks a fundamental philosophical distinction. I actually have taught for the last, when I ended my career, I taught at a university in a department in which people freely borrowed from, different traditions. Look, I mean, I have to say, there are figures from the history of philosophy who count as belonging to the Anglo-Saxon tradition who leave me cold, and there are figures from the continental tradition whom I find very exciting. I think what philosophy actually needs is a recognition of the fact that there are some philosophers who speak to us and some philosophers who don't, and they don't come in two categories, and you either go for one category or the other. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is that I do think that the Anglo-Saxon tradition has this important thing, has a certain kind of clarity of thought, which is often absent or difficult to discern in writers who are routinely classified as belonging to the continental tradition. And it's really the marriage of these two things that we want. I mean, I don't like the idea of sort of casual synthesizing. I mean, I'm not accusing continental philosophers of doing this, but the idea that if professional, well-trained philosophers don't do this synthetic work themselves, there will be people who write sort of synthetic philosophy, and it will be shallow and bad, and it won't be sufficiently analytic. I think that these two things really do need to be brought together. So that's the first answer. But I wish we would just get rid of this idea that there's analytic philosophy and continental. There are vast areas of difference among thinkers in each of those traditions, and I mean, I find reading some people who lived after Kant on continental Europe profoundly interesting, more interesting than I find some people who are allegedly part of my tradition.
And it's esoteric in its own way. I mean, the so-called continental philosophy. Okay, Professor Nehamas.
Given what you said about disagreement among philosophers, I'm going to be very rude because I'm going to agree with you. Since philosophy is the only human institution where agreement is a form of discourtesy. And I'd like to make 2 points if I can. In both cases, I agree with you, but I'd like to add a dimension. You started very interestingly by pointing out that the refinement of analytical methods has gone maybe farther than it should. And that's one of the reasons that we've lost the ear of the public. I think that is certainly one reason. Another one I think that we should mention, and it came up a little bit earlier, has to do with professionalization.
Mm-hmm.
A colleague of ours, Angelis Nikolakopoulos, years ago gave a lecture in which he started out by saying he wanted to open an account in the bank. And they said, "What's your profession?" And he said, "Philosopher." That's not a profession. I mean, philologist. That's not a philosopher. And in a way, there is something peculiar about the idea of being a professional philosopher. And it imposes certain conditions for what work you can do and how the work is evaluated.
Yep.
If you are in the professional situation we find ourselves in, it pays to work on smaller issues with clear answers, because then you can actually advance in the right way. And to some extent, that prevents you from taking the risks that I think your synthetic approach involves.
Yeah.
So that professionalization, I think, is a major issue for the condition of philosophical debate. So that was in addition to what you said. The second point has to do with, if you don't mind, has to do with what I would call your view of philosophy basically today as a collaborative enterprise. I think your molecular biology model.
Yeah.
And the fact that it was Aristotle and Kant that you bring in rather than Plato, for example. There is a tradition within philosophy, I think, that doesn't fit with that collaborative model. Kind of more individualist approach. And Plato, I think, what's amazing about Plato, and for me, he is the top, is that he stands at the head of both systematic philosophy and this other kind of peculiar individualist philosophy, Socrates, Montaigne, Nietzsche, Pascal. And it's not clear to me how the two fit together into one enterprise. But you may have the answer.
Well, I'd say 2 things. I mean, these will be further comments of a sort of generally agreeing nature that that sort of take it into slightly different directions. So you're absolutely right. I mean, the professionalization of philosophy is felt to be inhibiting by young people as they set out. When I have given talks or when people have written me emails about things they've read of mine on themes like this, they write saying, "I wish I could do what you recommend that I do, but of course I can't. I want to have a life in philosophy, and I must. What can I do?" So the last chapter of my book, "What's the Use of Philosophy?" is actually called "Letter to Some Young Philosophers," and it's an inadequate attempt to respond to this predicament. I mean, it is, I think, genuinely sad that a number of young people, I've no idea how many it is, but I've had a relatively sizable sample of comments on this, who have felt that they were inhibited in this way, that they could not take the risk.
There is a method for doing that. First,
That's right. Yes. Exactly. Possibly you and I might be seen as having followed that method, but okay. So with respect to the second point you made, I think that last remark has actually diverted me from what I wanted to say. But let me see if I can recapture it. Will it come back? The thought that. Okay. Yeah. Maybe that was right. Okay. Good.
But let me add something to what Alexander said. I mean, perhaps this image of the philosopher as a sage is what goes contrary to professionalization.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's an old image, which especially in Greece is very prominent. That's why.
That's terrific, because now I know exactly what I wanted to say.
You've been used.
No, not a sage, a perspective giver. And that, it seems to me, that's very important. I mean, Plato's perspective is immensely valuable. I mean, it may strike us as nutty and weird and you know, but some people may just love it. But I think Nietzsche and Plato are great examples of this, of people who say, I'm going to give you a completely different perspective from the one that you've had. My own individual vision.
That's not collaborative.
That is not. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And I have been for many years, for many different reasons, a fan of cognitive diversity. I mean, I think cognitive diversity in inquiries is immensely important, and so I want to foster that. So I welcome these people. Yeah.
Yes, and then yes, I want to ask, what's your opinion about philosophy and management, and if the ideas of philosophical ideas of Kafka and Sartre were used in management in a new domain, how can it work together? If it is about 10 years ago, we think that philosophy and management is going together. How does it work?
So I honestly don't know the answer to this, but I do know that in fact somebody whose thesis I supervised has been asked at various stages to give seminars for business people and to try to help. I mean, it seems to me that in the contemporary economic and context, that you have to enter that world may require you to hold your nose a bit and not to ask the kinds of philosophical questions that you might want to ask about the enterprise that is, as it were, paid for your services. So I think there's a certain kind of unease there, and the unease comes from the fact that the firms that are currently involved in this incredible economic competition which has been visited upon us are themselves given all sorts of perverse incentives to do all kinds of things that a philosopher might well worry a lot about. So I don't think the relationship can be a particularly easy one.
Yes, thank you for your talk. As someone coming from a field adjacent but different from philosophy, I find your talk of synthesizing, your impulse towards synthesizing, very refreshing, because so much of what is being talked about in the world situation is the atomization of things. So I like that very much. And I also like your impulse towards relevance. And in the vein of relevance, I'm curious. I also have never heard of the area of public philosophy. But in the vein of public philosophy, I'm wondering, perhaps especially since you are connected with Columbia, how you think public philosophy might respond to the current upheaval in America, especially at the universities like Harvard and Columbia, etc.
Oh, that's so complicated. I mean, it is surely a subject for philosophers to think hard about, but what has occurred requires an immense amount, I think, of social diagnosis. It requires us really to understand the ways in which this country and its population has gotten into such a polarized state, and to understand the ways in which that state has disrupted all kinds of institutions and the good that those institutions can provide. So my most recent book actually is not What's the Use of Philosophy. It's a book that's currently out in England but not out in the United States yet, called The Rich and the Poor, which tries to engage in a part of the diagnosis. But it was finished, and actually it was set in type before November of last year, and the situation that has now resulted is even more complicated. I would trace that situation in part, but only in part, to some of the things that I tried to analyze in that book.
Okay, so let me, your question, and then I'll ask a question at the end, and I think
Okay, all right.
Yeah, okay.
My question.
Could you speak up a little bit?
My question is the ability of your thinking in the professional university setting we have. Considering what you are proposing, there's, I imagine, a delicate balancing between relevance and allowing philosophers to play. My question is, how would you, within the current university structure of, say, the Anglophone world, inculcate this within universities themselves? How would that work?
Well, I think a modified version of what Alexander suggested is probably the most straightforward way to do it. You play by the rules, but you can, on the way, you can do your ventures in public philosophy. I mean, I know a number of young philosophers who are either graduate students or recent PhDs who are, thinking in terms of eventually doing something more risky, something more ambitious. But for the moment, they'll content themselves with the occasional piece written, as it might be, for New York Times or the Atlantic Monthly or something like that, on a particular issue where they will show their analytic skills, and that will, as it were, keep their desire to do something more direct quiet for the moment, until the time comes when they can spread their wings.
So let me ask a short question, going back to Yannis's question about fundamental issues that preoccupy philosophers. I think that some philosophical questions spring from the so-called human condition. I mean, being somehow thinking that it is an absurd situation we are in, so we are drawn to certain questions, somehow inescapably, even, by just using language, we are drawn to certain questions. And so it seems that this has some value in itself, rather than serving some other end. And so you cannot but deal with these questions as a philosopher.
Well, surely a satisfactory answer to the question how to live is going to involve wrestling with those kinds of questions, because you've got either to explain the feeling away, or you've got to suggest some ways of confining it or dealing with it or overcoming it. I don't think. There's a sense in which those questions are profoundly important if they continue to affect people in general. And I take it that your view about these questions is that they arise for all of us. It's more difficult if they only arise for some of us, but if they genuinely arise for all of us, then coming to terms with them is an important task of doing this Jamesian work of giving people, as it were, a clear view of them. Maybe the answer is this is something we've just got to live with, or the answer is no, you shouldn't think about it that way.
Okay, so Anna, okay,
I actually, I mean, so I mean, the why question I was trying to answer was, why is philosophy important? But the question you want me to answer is, why did philosophy stop doing the important stuff? And the answer to that may well be there's no single reason. That there are lots of different stories to be told with respect to different communities, and the answer may be very sort of very nitty-gritty and sociological in character, or there may be some sort of genuinely intellectual trend that led people to say, you know, clarity is what we really, I mean, it could be that philosophers finally say, you know, what the positivists wanted was, you know, to get beyond the history of philosophy. Now, they were wrong about criteria of cognitive significance and all the rest of it. But one thing they were right about was the power of reasoning and the need for clarity. And what we want is clarity. Clarity, 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 clarity. And so you get a fetish of clarity developing. And that goes along with also a fetish to formalize things. And so you wind up with this sort of, I mean, that might be the answer. But you know, you'd have to do quite a lot of research, I think, to be willing to bet on it.
Okay, so let's thank our speaker.
Well, thanks to all of you for your interest in, you know, what philosophy might be, and for taking, you know, my half-baked thoughts about reasonably seriously. I'm grateful to you. Thank you.